Welcome to the Reflection Podcast. This is a special episode for Holy Week 2024. If you don't know what Holy Week is and you've just stumbled upon this podcast, this is the week in the Christian calendar that we remember as followers of Jesus. Jesus rode into Jerusalem and the people shouted, Hosanna. Jesus, on the night that he's betrayed by Judas Iscariot, talks about the Lord's Supper, his body and his blood, as he celebrates the Passover meal. Good Friday, the day that Christians remember that Jesus died on the cross. Holy Saturday, where many Christians will recount how God has saved his people throughout Old Testament history. And many churches will also celebrate the sacrament of holy baptism that night. And then Easter Sunday, where Christians around the world will celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, an event that many people, and myself included, will signify as the most important event in human history, where God has died for his people and for all people and rises from the dead again to give us new life. Well, all of that is actually rooted in the Passover celebration that's first recorded in Exodus chapter 14. And I wanted to make those connections, or at least explore the connections of Jesus' death and resurrection with that ancient celebration of the Israelites called the Passover. And so I'm going to bring into the conversation someone that I think knows a whole lot about this. His name is Chad Bird, and he is a scholar in residence at a group called 1517.org, and that's also a website. They are a group of Christians that basically want to bring the gospel to as many people as possible, the story of Jesus. And Chad Bird is especially known for his studies in the Old Testament, and we are going to be in the book of Exodus today. And so I brought Chad on board via a chat box here, and we are going to talk about the connections of Passover with Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper and his death and his resurrection. And so let's pick up the conversation as I talk with Chad about this on this special episode of the Reflection Podcast.
The plagues kind of set us up for that by basically 3 rounds of 3 plagues each, all of which have to do with various elements in nature. And then after that, you have this 10th and climactic, I guess you could call it a plague, although it's specifically directed not at kind of elements of creation like the Nile or the sun, but in particular it's directed against humanity, against the firstborn of the Egyptians. So anyway, that's where it all begins. And then subsequently, of course, you have these annual celebrations of the Passover.
Okay, so Passover is recorded it starts in Exodus 7, the second book of the Bible, chapter 7, and actually covers chapter 7 through 13. And there were 10 plagues. I remember that because that was on a test when I was an undergrad, and we had to remember what the plagues were. And so my dorm mate and myself, we created a little song to try to remember that. And of course, I can't remember the song, but I remember the plagues, and it starts with basically the water turning to blood in the River Nile, and then, as you said, ends with the death of the firstborn. So we have water into blood. And I'm going through, this is from my ESV Bible, the way it's presented there, and correct me if it, or update us if it's a little bit different in the Hebrew. So we do the water in the blood, frogs, and then gnats, and then flies, and then the livestock die.
Yeah, the pestilence that kills the livestock. Yes.
Okay. And then we have boils, which was that on people as well as livestock, or just the people? I don't remember.
Yes, on both, I believe.
And then hail out of the sky that destroyed the vegetation, and then locusts come in and destroy the rest of the vegetation. And then we have the plague of darkness, where and I'm not sure exactly what that would look like. And then the last plague, the death of the firstborn in in Egypt, and then I assume also in Israel, if they did not have the blood on their doorposts, I would assume that that happened as well, because that's there is where the name Passover comes from.
Hmm. Yeah.
The angel would pass over that household that had blood on the lintel and the doorposts of the homes. Can you maybe give us a little background why these specific plagues? What's the deal with these 10, or at least the first 9? Why that?
I think there's a couple different ways that we can approach these, and these aren't contradictory ways, they're complementary ways. One is to see God basically uncreating Egypt, if you will. So if you go back to the creation account, one of the things that God loves to do is he begins with everything undivided. And there's somewhat of a kind of a chaotic feel to the beginning of Genesis. And then what God begins to do is he separates this from that. So dry land from the seas, and the upper waters from the lower waters. And so you have him in Hebrew, badal, so to divide, to separate. He separates this from that. And so he's ordering creation, begins with just formlessness and void, tohu vavohu in Hebrew. And then you have everything being divided, put into its place. So everything has a proper sphere, we might say. Now, what happens in Egypt, interestingly, is that God begins to kind of undo all of that. He begins to take Egypt and basically make it into kind of formlessness and void. So you have things not behaving as God made them to be. The sun is created to shine, and yet it darkens. The water of the Nile, or any water, is created to replenish fields as well as give drink to people, and now it's undrinkable. Frogs are supposed to be where there's water, and yet they come out of the water. So you kind of have God as a creator bringing Egypt back to kind of a Genesis 1 verse 2 moment, formless and void. And this actually fits with some of the prophecies that you'll find later in Isaiah, for instance, when God brings about a punishment upon Babylon or Assyria or Israel herself. Then, the wetland becomes dry and flowers are replaced by rocks. And you have basically God taking creation and turning it upside down. That's what he's doing in Egypt. So he's demonstrating his power as the creator in undoing the creation in Egypt. That's one way to look at the plagues. Another way to look at them, and this is probably the more common way, is that each of these plagues, or at least some of these plagues, are purposely designed to combat the deified elements of creation in the Egyptian theology. So take the first and the ninth of these. The first, of course, is the Nile being turned into blood, and the ninth is the sun being darkened. Both the Nile as well as the sun were deified in Egyptian theology. The Nile in particular was understood to be a god, and understandably so, according to their theology, because the Nile was a source of life for Egypt. You take away the Nile, Egypt ceases to be the breadbasket of the world, because it's by means of the Nile that you have this annual flooding, which leaves the rich soil, which allows them to grow the crops that they do. So they had deified the Nile. God attacks that, says, no, this is not a god. Look what I've done to it. I've turned this supposedly divine water into blood that makes this water undrinkable. And then solar deities or sun deities were common not only in Egypt, but really all over the world, as far as we know, certainly all over the ancient Near East. So Re, or Amon-Re, was the sun god, just like Shamash was the sun god in the Canaanite culture. So what God does is he takes this sun, which is supposed to be a god, and he darkens it. So, and you could do the same thing, for instance, with the frogs. There was an Egyptian frog goddess. And so you can see God purposely using these various plagues in order to demonstrate that there's really only one true God. So at one point in Exodus, he says, I'm going to attack or strike the gods of Egypt. So this was God's way of making it very clear that he alone was the one true God.
I get this too. I'm hearing the connection into Genesis and the creation account, and how it all came undone in Genesis 3 when Satan tempts Adam and Eve, you will be like God. And God is overturning that. It's like, no, because it's almost the logical progression. of how bad the world got from that Genesis 3 to Exodus 7 is that we think we're all gods, and God is saying,
Yeah.
no, there's only one
Yes.
true
Right.
God.
Well,
Another
Pharaoh certainly
connection.
thought that he was. I mean, in Egyptian theology, Pharaoh himself was the incarnation of a god. So you can also see kind of maybe underneath every single one of these plagues, whether it was against the Nile or against the sun or this was God tapping Pharaoh on the shoulder and saying, "You must not be that great of a god. You can't even control your own country, the elements of creation in your own country." So you can kind of read I mean, it's a serious account, but it's almost humorous too, in a dark sort of way. This is God kind of poking fun at these supposed gods that were all over Egypt, each time hammering home the fact of monotheism. These aren't gods. I am the one true God.
You talked about the water, I think I heard this. I don't know where I heard it recently. It was on a podcast I was listening to about water in the scriptures is often a representation of chaos,
Yeah,
and you
yeah.
have in Genesis, and then you also have the in Revelation at the end of the Bible, the water is taken away. The sea is no more. Means
Hmm.
chaos is no more, and the plagues start by making chaos out of the water again, and
Yeah.
making it so that it's like that. And then there's the other connection of going through the parting of the Red Sea. God makes
Hmm.
a level path for them, but that's after Passover, so we'll save that for another discussion. Okay,
Yeah.
so the 10th plague, which is the death of the firstborn, is directly tied to the Passover celebration of Exodus 13 and 14. So can you at least give us a summary of what it is that they were supposed to do uh,
Hmm.
according to, God tells Moses, tell the people, this is how I want you to get ready. And this became the original celebration of Passover. What did that entail?
Yeah, I like to call it the Israelite fast food celebration because everything was designed in order to be eaten quickly. Even they were in dressed, so they were ready to go. So they're supposed to dress with their loins girded, which means that basically they pull up their long robes, tie them up, they make robes into shorts, basically. So they're dressed for action, they're ready to go, staff in hand, bags packed, we might say. So you can kind of picture that as the setting. See, because it's that night they're going to be leaving. But before they get dressed and all of that, they choose an animal, and this animal is to be selected on the 10th of Nisan, which is or Aviv. It's the same month. It's the first day of the month in the spring, March, April. Uh, so they're supposed to select a 1 year old, and it's an unblemished animal. And we really think of the lamb, but initially it says from either the lambs or the goats. So later on, it's just a lamb, but that's kind of the way it started. So you have this 1 year old unblemished. Unblemished just meaning you can't be one that is missing a leg or has huge scars on it from an animal attack or something. It needs to be as perfect an animal as they can choose. So the best, in other words. That animal is selected. It's kept to the 14th, and then at sundown is when this animal is sacrificed. So the Passover is a sacrifice. Then you have two different things that happen. You have one with the blood, and you have one with the meat of the animal. And this is not unusual when you begin to look at what happens later in the Israelite sacrificial worship. Because very often what you will do is you have one thing done with the blood, and then one thing done with the meat of the animal. So often what happens with the blood at the tabernacle or the temple is it's placed upon the altar. And then the meat of the animal is either burnt completely on the altar, or part of it is, and then part of it's given back to the worshiper to consume in a holy meal. So what happens at the Passover is that. So you have the blood that's applied not to an altar, but to the doorpost and the lintel. So basically the frame of the door. It's painted on there. And then the animal itself is cooked, it's roasted, and then its body is consumed by those who are inside their houses. And God says he's going to see the blood of the animal, the victim sacrificed for them. He'll see the blood, and he will, in Hebrew, pasach, which is translated to pass over. It can also mean to limp or to skip. It kind of had this action of kind of up and down. So, for instance, in that famous scene where Elijah is going to have his battle with the prophets of Baal, he says to the Israelites who are gathered there, "How long will you limp between these two different opinions?" So that's the verb pasak. So I'm going to limp or skip or whatever it might be. So this is the idea of he's you're going along and you skip over or you jump over this or that. In this case, the destroyer that God is going to send is going to pass over, jump over the homes of the Israelites because they're shielded by the blood. So the blood shields them, and then inside the homes, as I like to put it, they eat the very one whose life was sacrificed for them. So they take into their very bodies the meat of the lamb, and thereby receive God's blessing. They're shielded from punishment. And then that very night, when you have God pass through and strike down all the firstborn of the unshielded, the Egyptians, then finally favor relents and the people are allowed to go free. So it's kind of the origin of everything that happened on that first Passover.
And as you said in Hebrew, it's pasak. And if for people who have been going to worship, especially during the season of Lent, in certain traditions, there will be, when the Lord's Supper is celebrated, there will be a prayer that talks about that we are being made ready for the Paschal feast.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
Pesach, the Paschal feast into English has basically the same as Easter. That's what we're talking about there. And in many churches we'll also have what's called a Paschal candle that is sort of dedicated or blessed on Holy Saturday, the night before Easter. So there's all these connections, which is why I wanted to have this conversation, because there's so many connections. And there's so much nuance to the Easter celebration in the Christian church to these ancient Hebrew and Israelite celebrations and observances. So it's interesting to me that they were told to do this forever. And, this will be something that you're going to do every year at the same time of year. But as we see in the scriptures, at least, that didn't happen, did it? Israel did not keep up that command.
Yeah, yeah. It's one of these oddities where you'll have something which is commanded and it's either not observed, or sometimes there's no record, at least, of its being observed. To just take another example, the Jubilee year, which is every 50th year. There's supposed to be a return of ancestral lands and a release of debt and all of that. And we don't have in the entire Old Testament any record of that being celebrated. Now, that's not, as sometimes they'll say, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. So, just because it's not recorded didn't mean it didn't happen, but it is one of those kind of oddities. But there were gaps of the celebration of the Passover for a variety of reasons. So you have the Passover celebrated in Joshua, that's mentioned. And then there is a long gap where you don't have Passover mentioned until you get these huge Passover celebrations under like Josiah and Hezekiah, when you have a Passover celebrated of such grand extent that there's long descriptions of everything that was entailed with its celebration.
Yeah, you mentioned Josiah, and that's what I was thinking. The text seems to imply that we have been doing this for a while and we need to get back to it. And the reason for that was because, well, they didn't read their Bibles. They didn't read the Pentateuch, the Torah, because it was gone for whatever. And of course we do have a record of these kings that now we know why they're not exactly upstanding citizens, certainly not following God's ways. And then Josiah's reforms brings that back again. How did the celebration change, though, over time? We're in the 15th century where it begins, and bring us into how, at least if we can, how was it celebrated after that? We don't have the blood anymore, but on the lintel and doorposts, as far as I know. But what is added? What's changed through the years?
Yeah, well, one of the things that did remain the same is it did remain kind of a family-oriented sacrificial meal that was akin to what were called the shalomim, the peace offerings or the peace sacrifices. So one of the categories of sacrifices in the Old Testament would be the peace offering, the shalomim, where you have the blood on the altar, and then the animal given back to the worshipers to consume in this communal meal. And the Passover was like that. So it did remain a family, or at least a close community kind of celebration. So that the continuity is there. The animal stayed basically the same, although, yeah, a couple different passages. You've got the lamb or the goat in Exodus. There is a suggestion, I believe it's Deuteronomy that has this, that it could even be from the herd. But certainly over time, it became just the Passover lamb. The lamb was the chosen animal that would be sacrificed. Now, certainly they're no longer in Egypt, and they're no longer putting the blood on the doorposts and lintels of their homes. Instead, the blood now is placed upon the altar, and that is a difference. And that's something that you can only have, of course, if you have an altar, which they didn't have in Egypt. But they began to have an altar when the tabernacle was built, and of course later on the temple. And that's another difference is, so if you were Jesus living in Nazareth, you didn't celebrate the Passover in Nazareth. Or if you were living, wherever else in Israel, you didn't celebrate the Passover at your home. You journeyed to Jerusalem because Passover, along with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, those were kind of celebrated together. Those are one of the three pilgrimage festivals, so called because you were a pilgrim. You did a pilgrimage to Jerusalem from wherever your home was. So that's one of the differences. Now you have everybody coming together to Jerusalem, and then everyone would be bringing their sacrifices, their lambs, to the temple, and the animals would be slain there, their blood placed upon the altar, and then the animal given back to the worshipers so they could celebrate the Passover. Now, I wish that we knew a lot more details about exactly how the Passover was celebrated in the first century. And the problem is the evidence is lacking. Now, here's what usually happens, at least in my experience. What usually happens is you will have people kind of taking evidence from 150 to 200 years later, which were written down in what's called the Mishnah, which is the writing down of what previously had been oral traditions. You will have them taking that kind of evidence, and even much later evidence from the Talmud and other Jewish writings, and then they import that into the New Testament. I understand why, because they're trying to fill in the gaps as to, okay, what did Jesus do when he gathered with his disciples? What exactly did he do? Well, we have scant details in the New Testament. The authors basically assume you know. Oh, well, you've been to Passover, so we don't have to tell you all of these details. So they assume we know. Well, we don't. And so what often happens is we'll import later evidence about the Passover Seder and all those details into the first century. The problem with doing that is we're on very thin ice because we don't know if those later traditions are actually later traditions or if they were earlier traditions only recorded later on. So all that to say, all the details of what Jesus would have done, for instance, with his family or with his disciples, with the 4 cups of wine when Jesus celebrated. Well, there were later on, but when Jesus did it, we don't know. I mean, was there the retelling of the story, such as this happened later in the Passover Haggadah? Probably, possibly. Again, we don't know. There's a lot of gaps in our knowledge with regard to what Jesus did with his disciples on that Passover night.
So I do want to talk about, what do we know about that night that Jesus was betrayed, as we often say in the liturgy for the Lord's Supper. One of the things that I picked up on, though, as you're talking about that, is there are certain things that they were told to do back in Exodus. When your children ask, this is what you tell them. And
Yes.
and that comes out in the Haggadah, where we recount the entire story then
Yeah.
of the Exodus. And that makes sense that they would do that. But and also, we're going to talk about the Lord's Supper as well, because that's what Jesus does on that night. He's got the Passover meal in front of him, and then he sort of, I guess, one way to put it is he changes this and kind of updates it or makes something new out of it. It's probably the best way to put it, more biblical way to put it. But I want to catch a nuance here. The Passover from Exodus on, it was a family meal. They did it as a family. Or if they didn't have enough, at least on the first Passover, if they had more lamb than they had people, then they brought in another family. But it was a very close knit type of celebration. They all did it, but they did it in their own little congregations. And
Mhm.
I'm wondering if that had something to do with what we would then call as Christians closed communion,
Mm.
where we're doing it as a family. But it was just something that popped into my head about that. So
Yeah, yeah, I think well, there were certainly parameters, let's put it that way. There were parameters as to who could and who could not celebrate the Passover. So, for instance, if you were just a foreigner living in Israel for whatever reason, you could not partake of the Passover. Whereas if you were a slave or a servant who lived with a household, and if you were male, if you were circumcised, then you could partake of the Passover. But just because you were living in the country, maybe for trading purposes or whatever it might be, or maybe you had been, you were fleeing from war or famine, whatever it is, and you were a sojourner in Israel, just because you lived there and just because maybe the Israelite family you were living next door to, were celebrating the Passover, it didn't mean that you could partake of that. So to kind of use the analogy today of close communion, there was certainly that aspect in the sense of there were people who could and people who could not, so those who were in and those who were out. And this wasn't based upon, if you were good enough or if you were moral enough. It was nothing like that. These were all kind of theological, ritual, what some churches might refer to as sacramental kinds of doorways that you had to enter into in order to partake. So if you were an uncircumcised male, no Passover for you. If you were, say, a Canaanite female, no Passover for you if you had not been incorporated into the body of Israelite believers.
was it really a confession of faith even then, that if you were these things, it's because this is what you believe, and that you believed
Hmm.
that what God was telling you was true.
Yeah, it would have been a confession of faith because the very act, for instance, let's just use men, for instance. If you have a man who's uncircumcised and he wants to actually believes in the one true God, wants to become part of Israel, it's not him just kind of putting his name on a piece of paper saying, yeah, I believe what they believe. He's undergoing what in that world would have been a very painful, physically altering ritual in order to say very clearly, I am inside Israel. In other words, what they believe is what I believe. And so by his mouth, he would be confessing the faith, but even by his body, so in his very physicality, he was also being brought into this community of confessors of the one true God.
So Jesus is the all four Gospels record us Jesus celebrating the last Passover before his crucifixion with his disciples. And if people want to look that up, it's in Matthew 26. Mark, I don't know if I wrote down the number down. I want to say Mark 13, Mark 14, somewhere around there. Luke 22 and John 13. What is it that Jesus and his disciples from the scriptures, the Gospels, what's part of this Passover meal?
Well, there's going to be a lamb for sure. There's going to be unleavened bread. We know that there was wine that was there. We're not, it's kind of what I was referring to a few minutes ago. We're not given many details about all the various elements of not just the liturgy itself, but the various parts of the meal that were included there. We do know there was wine. Of course, there would have been bread. There would have been the lamb, and presumably there would have been kind of what became the Haggadah, kind of the telling of the story itself. And we know that Jesus had to find a place to do this. He sent his disciples to get everything ready for the celebration of the Passover. So we know that that's would have been taking place. We know that in that day and time they would have been not sitting around a table or sitting in pews. They would have been reclining as was customary in Greco-Roman. It was kind of one of those Greco-Roman customs that were adopted by the Jews. So it would have been reclining with the table in the middle, and then people reclining on couches around. So that's kind of what we know, at least, of the elements that were included in the celebration.
And there is evidence in the text of that too, especially in John's gospel, where you have the recording of the one Jesus loves, as he is described, sort of reclining against
Yeah.
Jesus,
Right.
leaning up
Right.
against him.
Yeah. So you kind of picture if Jesus is reclining, I'm not acting this out. I don't know if they're listening to the podcast, I can't see what. So kind of picture in your mind, you're on your side, or Jesus is on his side, and he's on his elbow. And so his feet would be away from the table, meaning that someone's going to be reclining directly in front of him. Same posture, who could kind of lean back, as it were. And so his head would be right there by Jesus. So, yeah, I mean, the very actions that are described in John's gospel would fit this posture that we have in the supper.
And Da Vinci got it wrong, apparently.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Of course,
tall guy
it's
sitting on
interesting.
one side of the table.
Yeah, and it's interesting how too what's on the table. You've got, what is it, sardines all on the
Oh,
table as
I
well.
didn't realize that.
Yeah, it was apparently a delicacy in Milan.
Oh, okay.
So
Oh, that's too funny. Yeah.
yeah,
No, so I'm pretty sure no sardines in the original
yeah,
Passover.
probably not. At least I'm thankful, because I don't know if I can handle it.
No, I'm with you. Yeah, I would skip over that part.
So so Jesus has this Passover celebration, and then the words of institution kind of tell us this history,
Mhm.
that he took the bread, and it's going, since it's Passover, it's unleavened bread, bread without yeast. Back to your
Mhm.
analogy of fast food, they didn't
Yeah.
wait for it to rise. They cooked it
Yes.
right away, or baked it right away, and then he breaks it. I assume that's like a tearing it apart type of thing,
Hmm.
so that
Yes.
each one gets a portion. And then he says something. What does he say? And kind of why? What I want to make the connection now of why Jesus is using Passover to institute what we call the Lord's Supper.
Yeah, so this is phrased in different ways in Matthew 26 and Mark 14 and Luke 20, Luke 22. I'll just take Matthew's, for instance. So this is Matthew 26:26. He says, "Now as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it," and that means that he gave thanks to God, which when you bless bread, you're giving thanks to God, the giver. So he gave thanks. After blessing it, he broke it and gave it to his disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And Mark basically records the same thing. Take, this is my body. And Luke says, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." So in each case, he's taking the bread, with which they would have been familiar. I mean, this would have been nothing new to the disciples. Of course, you have unleavened bread at the Passover. What was different is when Jesus now takes the bread and says, "This isn't bread," or "This bread doesn't stand for something," but instead he says, "This bread is my body." Now, what was in the mind of the disciples when Jesus says this? Who knows? Most of the time, the disciples are very confused about things anyway. So, taking what they would have understood as the source of truth is never the direction we want to go. Step back from it and think about what they're celebrating. Okay, they're celebrating the Passover, when you would have had one body present that would have been consumed. And that would have been the Passover lamb. So if you were eating a body, that body would have been this lamb that was sacrificed and then given back and then cooked and then consumed. So what Jesus is doing, he's taking the bread part, the unleavened bread, and the lamb part, the Passover lamb, and he's kind of pulling these two together. And yet he's not saying this bread is the Passover lamb. He's saying this is my body, and you are to eat this. And in so doing, he brings the bread together with the lamb, and he basically says, both of these are me, my body. So I am the Passover lamb, and I'm giving you me, myself, my body, which the very next day is going to be sacrificed on the cross. But I'm giving you my body, which is going to be now for you the new and the better Passover lamb, the body that is not yet sacrificed, but will be sacrificed that very next day. And in that way, like you said, he's making this new. He's taking that which had been celebrated all these years, and he's not saying, "Oh, we're done with that." He's saying, what this was now leading up to is this very moment in which I give you something new and better than everything you had in the Passover before.
Yeah, I guess in a way he's completing what this
Yes.
was all, this was what was started in 1400s BC. He's completed it now. Um,
Yes.
I I like that connection with the body, because we don't use lamb in the Lord's Supper. We use bread, and it almost makes sense in the sense that everybody has bread. I mean, bread
Mm-hmm.
is a universal staple across the
Mm-hmm.
planet, and so use something that is just as ordinary and
Right.
as plentiful as anything else, and now making it very, very special because of what he says. He does say now, and in English, he says, "This is my body." That's a big thing with our our particular tribe of Lutheranism, that Jesus meant that
Yes.
is means is not
Is. Yeah.
not symbolize,
Right.
not
Right.
represents so much to that effect. I mean, does that translate then directly from well, Jesus would have said it in Aramaic, but we get it in
Mm-hmm.
Greek.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's accurate. It's a literal translation. And it's, you know, I was raised outside Lutheran circles, and the very first change that I guess you could call it that, the very change in confession that I made was actually to believe that Jesus meant what he said. It just seems straightforward to me that if he says this bread is his body, well, then it is. I didn't have any, for whatever reason, it was an easy hurdle for me to get over. Because you think about it this way, if God spoke and everything in creation came to be, or if God spoke and a person was healed of whatever disease afflicted them, or if God spoke and this or that happened, if Jesus could say, "Come forth, Lazarus," and by means just of saying that, raise a dead man, then he can say, "This is my body," and it is of the bread. So I find it just kind of a straightforward confession of anyone who holds to the divinity of Jesus and his power to speak into existence that which he says. So yeah, I mean, there's certainly symbolism, plenty of
Yeah. Oh
symbolism
yeah.
there. We're not denying that there's symbolism attached to this. Of course there is. Uh, but to say that the bread is his body is simply to repeat what Jesus said. We don't have to understand it. All you have to do is confess it to be, in fact, true.
Yep. I mean, on Monday, Thursday this year at our church, our confirmands, that are a second year confirmands, get their first communion.
Mm.
And it's just one of those things where, you don't have to understand this. You just have
Yeah.
to believe it. Take Jesus at
Yes.
his word. He's not going to lie to you.
Yeah, yeah. I love the C.S. Lewis quote. I think it's in his book Letters to Malcolm, where he says that Jesus said, "Take, eat, not take, understand." So it's not a you don't have to engage in mental gymnastics. You just have to take Jesus at his word.
That's right.
He said what he said.
So he takes the bread. Now we have wine introduced into the Passover celebration, basically for the first time in the scriptures. Wine is not mentioned in Exodus. It is mentioned in the prophets, not necessarily, I'm thinking, connected to Passover,
Yes.
but wine was a staple
Hmm.
of the Israelites.
Yes.
But now Jesus takes some wine. What's he doing with that?
Yeah, so you do have wine that's involved in some of the temple rituals. You have drink offerings that were poured out. So wine was at least part of the Israelite worship liturgy. And yeah, it becomes a symbol in several different places in the prophet. It can be used negatively in the sense of people kind of intoxicated by the judgment of God. They drink the cup of God's wrath. But you also have plenty of positive images as well. I shall take the cup of salvation and call upon the name of the Lord, or my cup overflows. So this image of the cup of wine being the source of blessing from God to his people is rooted in the Psalms as well as in the prophets. Now, what Jesus does, depending on which evangelist you read, is he takes this cup, and when he gives it to his disciples to drink, he gives thanks. He gives them his cup to drink. Then he says this. So Matthew puts it this way: "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." And then Mark says, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. And then Luke says, this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. There's a couple things that unite all three of those. First of all, he is identifying the cup or the wine in the cup with his blood. And of course, that's the parallel, the kind of the flip side to his identifying the bread as his body. Now he identifies the wine as his blood. So just like he could speak and the bread is his body, now he speaks and the wine is his blood. And I want to come back to that in a second. But the other element that's common to these also is this language of blood of the new covenant. Now, the reason that is so significant is because that almost identical language is what we find in Exodus 24 when you have the first covenant instituted. This is when you have that, it's kind of a different sort of scene. Moses offers sacrifices and he takes half the blood, pours it on the altar. The other half he actually sprinkles on the people and says, this is the blood of the covenant. So that kind of echo of what's happening in the first covenant, what's happening now is unmistakable. So this is a new covenant, the very new covenant that Jeremiah prophesied would happen, being put into effect. And just like that blood sanctified the Israelites for their initiation into the covenant, so this blood is going to sanctify the consumers of Jesus' blood internally, which is the difference. It's not sprinkled on us, it's sprinkled in us, if you will. We consume this blood of the covenant. Now, this links to Passover because once more, like you had the body of the Passover lamb now identified as Jesus, his body, he being the lamb. Now you have the blood, which was shed by the lambs in the original Passovers and then protected them. Now this blood is not painted on kind of a door frame or something external, but rather it's actually painted inside us, if you will, so that we take into ourselves this protective blood and we're shielded by that blood. So in this way, I mean, if the consuming of the body of Jesus is a fulfillment of the Passover, just imagine what this is for the disciples. Because first of all, blood was never to be consumed in the old covenant. The blood was the life, and now Jesus is taking that prohibition and he's saying that prohibition is no longer in effect with regard to this. Now you're going to take into yourself the very blood that's shed for you.
John picks up on that in John 6, which is years before. It's at the feeding of the 5,000, actually, where he literally talks about, you're going to eat my flesh and you're going to drink my blood. Yeah, and it would almost, I can imagine it being abhorrent to them because that was, it was exactly what God said not to do. And yet now we're going to do it. And he does say it's for the forgiveness of sins that this, and I can hear the connection. It's poured out and it will be on the cross the next day or within, less than 24 hours later. It will that will actually literally happen. But that's not what Passover was about, was it? Passover was not about forgiveness of sins. And that's where I get this question about, why does Jesus do this at Passover and not at the Jewish festival where the forgiveness of sins happens, which is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement? Help me with that.
Yeah, it's a legitimate question because it is a different focus. I think what's helpful here is to kind of rethink in broader terms everything, kind of the complex theological notions of release, redemption, forgiveness, all these sorts of God gift kind of words in connection with the original Exodus as well as what's happening here at the Passover. So it wasn't as if the Israelites needed to have forgiveness of sins in the original Passover. They needed to be rescued, right? I mean, they were slaves. I'm not saying they didn't need forgiveness, but the purpose of this was to release them from their captivity. Now, when you take that understanding of the original Passover, release from captivity, and then you translate that over into what Jesus is doing, it kind of begins to make sense because what really is the forgiveness of sins? It's the key that unlocks the chains that bind us, the chains of sin, death, the power of the devil, all of those things in which we are enslaved in our own Egypts. These are now unlocked and we are freed in order that we too might be released from the multitude of Egypts in which we find ourselves. So understanding the forgiveness of sins here as kind of a part for a whole. It's certainly you receive forgiveness, but as Luther says in the Catechism, where there's forgiveness of sins, there's also life and salvation. And we could also add where there's life and salvation, there's also redemption. And where there's redemption, there's release, there's freedom, all of these things. So you can't receive just one gift of God without receiving all these other gifts that come along with it. So, I mean, we don't want to change the words of Jesus, but you could say, drink of it, all of you. This blood is poured out for you for release, for redemption, for life, for salvation, for forgiveness, because all of those things are entailed in the forgiveness of sins.
So if see if I'm right here in trying to unpack this a bit. Passover, Jesus does this at the specific celebration of Passover, but what he's really doing is taking all of them, all of the festivals, and kind of combining them into one, kind of like what we do in our worship service on a Sunday morning, especially if you're using a liturgy. You're actually using all of Jesus' life. The Christmas is in there with the Gloria in Excelsis, and this is the feast. You have the Ascension and the second coming of Christ, and the death and the resurrection and the life of Jesus in the sermon and in the readings. So he's kind of combining them all together into one compact, succinct act for his people to take.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's the perfect way to think about it. Everything that happens on Sunday morning is taking the entire kind of Old Testament liturgical year, we could call it, and its fulfillment in the life of Jesus, and then presenting this to us Sunday after Sunday. So you have, everything from creation woven into the liturgy to eschatology woven into the liturgy, and Christ binding it all together. So to go back to kind of the Passover and Yom Kippur, yeah, what's happening is happening in the context of the Passover, but what gives Passover its power, we might say, or this fulfilled Passover its power, is what's going to happen the next day when Jesus is crucified. Well, what happens in his crucifixion? Well, if you read, of course, the book of Hebrews, so that's going to, for 3 chapters, is going to explain that what Jesus did in his death on Good Friday is fulfill Yom Kippur, is fulfill the Day of Atonement. So even though in the Israelite year, Passover's in the spring and the Day of Atonement's in the fall, these are brought together into kind of a Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday sequence in the life of Jesus.
Sure. And that kind of brings me into the sort of wrapping up this, our last part of the conversation. We haven't talked about, and I'm sure there are some people out there who have studied this. What about First Corinthians? Jesus, the Passover was done once a year, and supposedly every year, but just once a year. But now we get into First Corinthians 10 and First Corinthians 11, and Paul is he making a connection to Passover, or is he looking at this as here's the Christian practice, and it's not just once a year, it's I guess we could say every week. Is that what Paul is doing there?
Yeah, so Paul, of course, will refer to Christ as the Passover lamb. Christ, our Pascha, has been sacrificed. So he has an understanding of Christ being the Passover, being the fulfillment of the Passover. But then what happens is that this fulfilled Passover ceases to be an annual commemoration and becomes a weekly celebration. Every Lord's Day, which is, in our calendars is Sunday, every Lord's Day becomes not just Passover, but also becomes Pentecost, becomes Tabernacles, it becomes Yom Kippur, as you just said. That's the uniqueness of the Christian celebration, is that you have everything from Genesis to Revelation, creation, eschatology, everything brought together into this weekly celebration. Of course, there's plenty of times when we can especially focus upon, the resurrection or the incarnation or whatever it might be. But every week then becomes the proclamation of the Lord's death until he comes through preaching, through Bible reading, through the Lord's Supper.
And that is one of the things that we talk about in specific liturgies. Every time you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. And I teach my confirmation students that, and if you're proclaiming the Lord's death, you're also proclaiming his life. And if you're
Yes.
proclaiming his life, you're proclaiming his birth. And if you're proclaiming his birth, you're proclaiming all of the prophecies that foretold his birth. And really, it's not just the death; it's
Hmm.
everything from
Yeah.
Genesis to Revelation. And every
Yeah.
time we come together, and this is why then the confession of faith also becomes very important too.
Hmm.
And as you said, Passover was done by the people of God. It was a very specific group of people who believed a very specific thing.
Hmm.
Communion is the same way. Of course, God is for all people, but it's also a very public confession of what we are doing in what Jesus has done for us.
Yeah. It the Eucharist, communion, whatever you want to call it, has always been it's not a kind of a public meal in the sense of, it's a restaurant.
Right.
Everyone's invited. This, varies from tradition to tradition, but there's always been parameters set up because it's understood to be, and I kind of approach this from a Levitical perspective. There were certain things that you were careful that you were ritually prepared to accept and to receive, because if you were unclean, then that which was good, intended by God to be good for you, could actually be harmful to you, because it had this divine power within it to communicate good or harm. You can compare it to electricity. Electricity is great until it's treated in an irresponsible sort of way. Then it can be harmful or even deadly. And the holiness of God can be like that too. And what the Lord's Supper is, it's a holiness that's consumable. And so it's to be treated with respect and as the good gift that it is. And if it's mistreated, then it can also actually be harmful to those who consume it in a way that is not in keeping with its sanctity. Put it that way.
Well, that kind of wraps up the conversation. Is there something I missed that maybe you wanted to make sure that we brought out before we head off here?
I'm sure that there is some, probably both of us missed, and maybe those who listen will point that out to us. I mean, this is one of those topics we would go on and on about, because there is tremendous depth that's there with regard to the Passover as well as the Lord's Supper. But I think that we touch on, the origins, the ongoing celebration, its connection to the events in the life of Jesus. So it's a good entry point into all of those discussions.
Well, I want to thank you, Chad Bird from 1517.org, for helping me unpack this. And I pray that this conversation will be a blessing to all those who are celebrating Holy Week when this episode actually drops. Thanks again, Chad.
You bet. Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Well, I know I need to take a break and take a breath. What an incredible conversation. I love listening to Chad explain things for us from the scriptures, and he did a wonderful job. I was uh, just in awe and enthralled by his connection of the Passover celebration as recorded in the book of Exodus and Jesus' institution of the Lord's Supper and his death and resurrection that we often called the Paschal Feast. Thank you, Chad, for that. Once again, Chad can be found at 1517.org, and others there can tell you more about Jesus and what it means to be a follower of Jesus. So I will have a link to that website in the show notes today. Also, you can find Chad on social media. He does videos on TikTok and Instagram and Twitter. That's where I watch him on those socials. And he also has a podcast on the Psalms as well as the Old Testament that he has out there from 1517 podcasts. And there are links to that at 1517.org. I want to thank you for joining me for this special edition of the Reflection Podcast. Reflection Podcast is produced by St. Matthew Lutheran Church in Hawthorne Woods, Illinois. I'm Ed Blonski. I am one of the pastors on staff at St. Matthew, and we would love to have you join us if you are in the northwest suburbs of Chicago, about a half hour north and west of O'Hare Airport, and about an hour north and west of Chicago itself. We would love to have you come and visit us. You can plan your visit by going to our website. Link is in the show notes, but it's at stmatts.net, stmatts.net. But even if you're not in the local area where you can join us in person for worship, all of our worship services and many of our Bible studies and special events are streamed live on our website. We also have a YouTube channel and a Facebook page where our videos can be seen, and we have devotions, and we have Bible studies, and we have worship services. So you can connect with us that way. We love to have you rate this podcast and share it and make a comment, and that helps the algorithms, that's the word I'm looking for, to get this out to as many people as possible, because that's why we exist. St. Matthew is here because there is boundless need all around us, and we have the boundless love of Jesus that meets all that need. And once that is shared, we can all live with boundless hope. Our podcast music was provided by the podcasthost.com and Alitu, the podcast maker. And you can find your own podcast music over at thepodcasthost.com/free music. So be on the lookout. Season 3 of the Reflection Podcast will be coming up in a few months. We're working on those shows right now. If you know of anyone that you would like to hear me talk with on the Reflection Podcast, just drop me a note, send me an email or a comment or a tweet and a direct message, and I would love to hear from you about upcoming guests that you would like to see on the Reflection Podcast or hear. We are both on YouTube and wherever you hear your audio podcast. We are hosted by Spotify, but we're also on Apple Podcast and Google Podcasts and iHeartRadio Podcasts, so you can listen to us that way. Once again, thank you, and I pray that you will have a blessed time of Easter when this show originally airs during Holy Week of 2024, and that God will truly richly bless you. And I'd love to hear from you. Join us again next time for the Reflection Podcast.